The Magnavox Historical Preservation Association has been actively engaged in preserving and telling the story of the Magnavox Company. To achieve this goal, they developed and opened an exhibit on Magnavox in 2011 in Greenville, Tennessee. In addition, we have continued to acquire artifacts and memorabilia and are having conversations with former Magnavox employees. From its beginning in 1911 in California, where Magnavox invented the loudspeaker, the company grew to become a leader in sound reproduction. The company headquarters moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana in the mid-1930s and continued to expand in the fields of home entertainment and military hardware, playing a key role during World War II. Following the war, the company grew rapidly in the field of consumer electronics. In 1947, they located a new plant in Greenville, Tennessee, to produce radios and cabinets. This operation flourished in the 1950s and 60s, producing a variety of products, including record players, radios, and televisions. In 1974, Magnavox was acquired by North American Philips, who continued operations in Greenville into 1996. I am George Collins, and I'm very pleased to have with me today three former Magnavox employees, Stanley Weems, Kay Broyles, and Bob Bousch. Welcome. First, I thank you for joining us, and I'd like you to first share with us a little bit about when you worked at Magnavox and your general responsibility. Stanley, why don't we start with you?
Alrighty, thanks, George. I was hired in September 3rd in 1963 as an assembler. Worked for Earl Jones, and I believe it was on Final Line 6. And I'm not sure of the period, but I think we worked 3 or 4 months and I was laid off and then came back the next year. Magnavox production usually was in the fall for the Christmas season, and that's when their big production took place. So I worked on several assembly lines at one time, and I worked for Cotton Whittenburg on the set behind us, I'm sure, in 1963, the picture of the set behind us, and worked for Earl Jones, Cotton Whittenburg, Lawrence Ricker, in several capacities as assembly on a production line, and later I became a group leader that would relieve the workers so they could use the bathroom, which was an upgraded job. And then after that job, I became a tester, set up the sets in booth tests, and then I became a repairman and worked on various lines, and including the chassis assembly lines in the color sets in the early 60s. And eventually wound up in Plant 2 in the service department working for Gene Graham on tape recorders. And later they transferred me across the street to work on the color TVs. And then at one time during the cutback, I was transferred back to Plant 3 and worked on the chassis assembly lines repair again for quite a while. And at one time I was a quality control technician on the chassis assembly line. So I had quite a bit of experience, and I left in 1981 and later acquired a service shop and became a factory service center for several years doing Magnavox service.
Interesting. Thank you. Kay?
Well, I was hired in Magnavox in October of 1950. I was hired in and placed a job of stockman or stock person. And after probably a year's time, they decided that they wanted to start packing some kits out. Now, in the cabinet department, which was downstairs from production at Plant 2, they made the cabinets, whatever we needed. And we made some cabinets that was sold with a place to install a TV. So when this startup happened, it became my job to take control of this operation and package all the necessary parts that it was required to install that TV into the cabinets that had already been sold. Some people wanted it. They had a fine cabinet. They had a record player and they had a radio. Now they wanted a TV, so we shipped packaged and shipped TV kits. I was still assigned to that job until I was drafted into the Army in 1953. And upon my returning in 1955, I was placed in the job as supervisor of subassembly. And from that, I was moved up in different positions. I became foreman of subassembly. Later, I became general foreman of production and subassembly. Then from there, I just grew with the plant. Mainly, I was general foreman of TV in certain areas, and then the assignment of the projection TV came along, and they asked me to take that over. It was already in operation. So I was in producing projection TV then for until 1969, I believe it was. No, yeah, say 89. I was in projection TV then for about 4 or 5 years before I retired. I've skipped several things that I had worked at, but it's taken up quite a bit of time.
That's all right.
When I came back out of projection TV, I became sale manager of the B product. And that's where I was at the time of my retirement, was in charge of the B product from beginning to end.
What do you mean when you say B product? What is?
That is, we had A product, B product, C product. C product was the top of the line. You had all the bells and whistles that we were installing at that time. And eventually that was phased out, and we just had the A and B product. So they combined some features of the C product into the B product. And so the B product became the leading top of the line, and the A product was a little lesser in what all you would get, all the bells and whistles and so forth.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. Got some follow-up. I want to come back with you on a couple of things there. Bob.
Well, I started with Magnavox in 1962 in Fort Wayne Engineering. They were just developing the color television group. Before that, they were buying chassis from RCA. And in 62, we were still buying an RCA chassis. In fact, one of my first assignments was to convert all RCA numbers to Magnavox numbers of all the parts, which was quite a challenge. And after that, it was mostly design development type work, working for Paul Knauer. And I made many a trip down to Greenville during all the prototypes and pilot runs and etc., the designs. I continued in the engineering group through about 1972 when I came down to Greenville. At that time, I was involved with life testing and quality control group. And we were just getting ready to start a new area of life testing called short-term life test, which was going to be a higher volume testing than the long-term stuff where we only tested a few units. And we set up a new facility in Plant 3 at that time, And that continued until we built actually a brand new facility within the plant, a plant within the plant. We also, as a sort of a sidebar that developed out of it, we also became very involved in forensics of components and et cetera. I had a group that I headed that did failure analysis work on all kinds of components. We had a scanning electron microscope and spectrometers and all that type of stuff. And we did a lot of work with the plant. As far down as even residues that we'd find on boards and things, we could determine what caused them and that type of thing, which is almost a whole separate subject. It gets quite interesting.
As I shared with you all before we started our conversation, there's some terminology you all will be using that I don't understand, and our people who will be looking at this oral history in the future may not, technology may have changed. What do you mean by life testing?
Well, we brought a product in, and we would, before, when we just had long-term life testing, we would test it for basically 1,000 hours of life, and then a group of sets would actually be extended out to 5,000 and 10,000 hours to determine what the vulnerability was of the product in the field.
So it's the life of the product.
The life of the product.
Okay. All right.
And when we decided to go to short term, that was a 1 week test where we brought in very high volume, fairly high percentage of product and tested it. When we got the newer facility built, we were testing about 2,000 television sets at one time. So then we also had a long term. From there, we'd pick out sets that went to long term and then extended long term.
Was every set tested before it was shipped out?
Well, every set's tested on the line,
Okay.
but these were randomly selected sets that would be brought into short-term life test.
I have a question on that. I wasn't familiar with, but I was under the assumption at one time that you life tested every set off production.
Well, we had a area called High Rel.
Well,
That was a I'm trying to remember exactly what period of time that was. It just escapes me.
it was
But
in the vicinity of 74, 75, I believe, in the beginning.
yeah, around that. Probably closer to 75 to 80 in there. Every set was tested basically for about a 24-hour period.
But this consisted basically of the transistor sets. It didn't include any of the tube type
Right,
sets.
that was after transistor.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing you mentioned was forensics, which
Yeah.
those watching television programs today, I'm sure that may have a little bit different meaning.
Well, not much. We would take failed components. For example, if a component failed in life test, that's how we ended up developing this equipment and stuff. Is we would actually take that component and tear it down completely and determine what made it fail, so we could get back with the manufacturers of those components to help improve the product.
Kay, back to one of the points that you made, and we're jumping around in years here, which is fine. You talked about making cabinets that were kits, in a sense. You shipped out a cabinet that had no components in it?
No TV in it.
No
We
TV?
built some cabinets that had a radio, phono, and a place for a small TV, a 17-inch, I believe is what it was that we were building at that time.
Okay.
And somebody ordered a TV for that cabinet.
From a separate supplier?
From separate. Well, no, it come through Magnavox.
Oh, okay.
It was Magnavox owned and operated.
But the homeowner then, or the owner of the
Yeah,
set, could put it together?
Now, I'm not familiar at that end of it, how it was installed. I just, and y'all don't know whether the company. We used to have, what was those places?
Service centers or
Yeah, service centers. Well, place where Magnavox was, they sold the sets. Now they're sold to everybody. But I mean, Magnavox, had their own dealers. Yeah, that's why they're all dealers and all.
We had basically servicing dealers at that time.
Yeah.
Well, one reason I'm curious about that is we have a couple of cabinets in the archives of the Magnavox historical group which have no components in them. They appear never to have had. They look like sort of in a 1950-51 period. Could that possibly be some of these cabinets that were produced for things to be inserted into later?
50, 51.
if you're talking about the
That's
ones.
a little- Yeah, it could be along about 52. Because I went into service 53, and I know I'd been packing those kits for at least a year. So it could very possibly be some.
Stanley?
And I don't have anything to
Were you
do
speaking of
with
those two cabinets you got from me?
Uh,
The doors on the front?
That's one, and then we acquired another one that has no components in it.
I'm not familiar with what he's talking about. That must have happened before I came to work in Magnavox. But the cabinets that I had that we were using for bookcases, I understand the lady that lived on my uncle's farm worked at Tincraft in the 50s, and
What was Tencraft?
it was just a company, Magnavox company. They called it Tincraft Plant One, that was manufacturer of cabinets, and the whole manufacturing place took place over there. Radios and TVs and all, did it not, in the
yeah.
beginning?
Plant one.
Plant One. So it was called Tincraft. Later, I think it only produced cabinets for a while.
Okay.
But anyway, I think these cabinets were acquired by this person because they were defective or extras or whatever, and they just was given or sold to some of the employees.
Okay. I'd never heard about this
Yeah.
kit approach to your TV, and I just find it fascinating.
In fact,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
didn't they have a label on the back says this unit's TV ready or something like that, or it had some kind of a
Yeah, but
little label on them. I remember seeing.
Each, he's talking about a service center. Magnavox had zones set up, like in Atlanta, California, Indiana, and separate places for parts centers. In other words, if you ordered a part from a service center, of course, and later I ordered from Greenville, and they would come from Atlanta, or if you're in California, they'd come from there, and the service center in Greenville would ship the parts to those. And I don't know if they had any particular repair centers or not that were operated by the company. I'm not sure about that.
I'm not either.
One of the questions that's intrigued me is Magnavox was not the first to produce television. They did produce the first TV in Greenville in 1950, and then their first color set was produced in Greenville in 63. Could you talk a little bit about that as to, A, why they got into TV production in 50, which is fairly early. But then you also, Bob, talked about the fact that the early sets, I'm assuming you meant color sets, were RCA
When we
chassis.
first got into the business,
Share a little bit about what they were thinking, what was going on with the company that they, I guess it's understandable why they got into TV production. It was the newest thing. But why didn't they produce their own stuff right at the beginning? Why did they?
Well, I think the biggest problem was engineering talent. RCA had one of the first chassis available, and they produced back in the 60s, probably 60, 61, and 62. They actually built chassis for several companies. And the of course, color television was pretty new about then. NBC, which I worked for before, had just converted over to color in about, I believe, as far as major conversion to a lot of places, in about 58, somewhere around in there. First broadcast is, around 55, 56 color. So, color was pretty infant stage in the 60s. So everybody wanted to get into color. Magnavox knew they had a good cabinet and stuff, and it was an opportunity for them to jump into the color TV market.
I wondered if it perhaps wasn't a patent thing on RCA.
No, I don't think so. There was some patent. A lot of the patents were held by a patent holding company, actually, Hazeltine, out of Chicago, and they and Motorola and RCA bought patent rights through Hazeltine, just like a lot of the rest of us did.
Okay.
And first chassis, like I say, that we really got into were in '62 that we actually manufactured for ourselves. It was the 45 series chassis, as you alluded to before, the mailbox high voltage system, or CAN. But that's pretty, that's
Okay.
sort of got us started. And like I said, when I joined the group, it was very small, one man, and he had just hired another one,
Okay.
and I was number 3 in the group. So we were very, very early as far as that.
Now, today, when we think about technology, they say you buy something 6 months, it's going to be out of date because the technology changes so rapidly. With them producing a first TV here in Greenville in 1950 and then producing the first color set in '63, was the technology changing very rapidly at that point forward? And if so, what was Magnavox's role in that? Were they in a leadership position in some of the changes?
In some of the areas we were. We had developed quite a few patents of our own of new technology. I guess if you look at it, as you're in the business doing it, it doesn't seem like it's moving that fast. But looking back on it, it was moving pretty good rate.
What were some of those changes that you all saw in the plants and on the lines?
You're speaking of in the tube types in the beginning?
Well,
was all
technology
tube,
changes. When you were in the plant putting these things together and seeing them and servicing them, what were the things you were beginning to see that was different from one year to the next?
Well, basically, I think a lot of it was geared to the market as far as the NBC and some of the people that transmitted this. In the beginning, color sets, or a lot of the big cities had cable systems, and there weren't any TV stations in the outlying areas except in the bigger cities. And some of the first TVs didn't have any UHF receivers, any tuners in them, and later that was changed to encompass the cable channels, and they had built converters in the TV sets. This was later years than that, but some of that was dictated by the manufacturer, by the TV stations, and where it was sold, as far as the differences in them. Magnavox had what they call a chromatone switch, would add more color, which was a sales thing. When you'd flip it, it would lower the intensity of some of the bright colors, or the bright lights rather, and keep the darker colors. And also later they had what they called instant on, and they added a circuit that would keep the picture tube itself lit up with 2 volts in order to, when you turned the set on, it'd come on almost instantly. So things like that was developed down through the years.
Now, you mentioned UHF. For those who don't know, what is UHF?
Well, VHF is a frequency that was transmitted basically on the lower channels, and it would go up to channel 13. I'm not sure the frequency number of that, the broadcast frequency. Okay, and then UHF was ultra high frequency, which was I think easier to transmit, a lot easier to transmit than the lower frequency. So in other words, in the bands between the UHF and the VHF were already taken up. So whenever cable companies wanted to go from channel 2 to channel 42, then there was that broad spectrum in between, and they couldn't go to UHF. So they developed a circuit called, made the set cable ready, which converted some of those stations to the lower channels. And so when you had your remote control, you could go from 2 to 69, I believe.
Kay, he mentioned this electronic eye thing. As I said, I'm not a technician. You were generous enough to donate a 61, I believe it was a 61 console that had a little red electronic eye.
Yeah.
Is that what he's talking
That
about?
changes the intensity. You know, if you turn the lights out in the room, it changes brightness of your picture tube. If you turn your
Automatically.
light, yeah, automatically. That's
It's quite an
what he's
innovation,
talking
huh?
yeah.
Well,
It was just a very small eye with a couple of leads coming out of it, plugged into the chassis.
It was
you
a-
know, we also had in that same period of time, there was a lot of shows that were still in black and white. So we had a sepia switch
that would,
where we could flip, and your picture got that brown tone, that sepia look. That was quite popular for quite a few years in early color sets.
Black and white, sepia, and color. There's a combination.
well, what you're speaking of the electronic eye, of the photoelectric eye, that if light hit it, it would reduce the brightness of the contrast so you could view it better in the dark. And if, or vice versa, if you had more light in the room, the picture would get brighter, I believe. And if it got darker,
Right.
the picture would get darker. So that's what that electronic eye did. I believe, unless I've got it reversed, but
No,
You got it right,
You're
Kay?
right.
Is he right?
Yep.
Okay.
And we also had another color feature in those very early sets. We had a little eye that would light up down in the corner. When a broadcast was broadcast in color, this little light would light and say, in fact, it was a little red, blue, green light
yes.
would light up in the corner of the mass and say, this show is being broadcast in color. Because what would happen, a lot of people, well, I don't want to get too technical, but bursts would come through and make a black and white picture have ringing in the picture. And it
Have
was
what
very
in the picture?
Ringing. You had color that wasn't really color.
Oh, okay.
And so a lot of people would turn, this is previous to the light, would turn their color knob down. Well, you didn't know if you had a color show because you'd be watching it in black and white. So this light would light and say, oh, this is a color show. And they go up and turn
So you
the
can
color.
adjust the TV.
Right.
I'm very familiar with that phenomena he's talking about. Later years, they developed a color killer circuit, and we had a control in the back to adjust that with. And what you did when you adjusted it, you would have the color signal. You could see the color rolling on the screen, and you'd turn it down till that disappeared. And I'm not sure if we get into electronics or how that worked, but the color set itself had a generator or a crystal, and it produced that signal, and it was compatible with the one that was transmitted. And when those two came together, it produced a color.
Kay, in terms of, you were out putting these things together, is that correct? If I'm defining part of what you did?
Yeah.
What were the changes on the lines when all these people came up with these great new ideas and shipped them down to Greenville and incorporated them? What effect did that have on you and the people who worked with you in terms of their daily work?
Well, we'd have to take a unit. They would send us a unit with everything in it that they wanted to produce. And then we had the job, our engineering department really, to go through that and determine at what point that gets installed. And also we had a group that we had process engineers, and we had to process the line to where those different features appeared at a certain point in order to get tested and what have you. So that's just a roundabout figure. Bob may be able to add a little bit to that too.
Since you sort of deconstructed what they came up with to figure out how to.
Yeah, because we have to reprocess the line to match the product.
Were all the all the components made? Were they made in Greenville or
No,
other,
all over.
All over. Okay. Different suppliers. It was suppliers other than Magnavox.
Oh, yeah. To that point, engineering, once they developed a chassis design, they built a prototype or two, and they'd come down, they'd bring them down here to Greenville, and we would actually set up a pilot run of that product and build a small quantity, very small first.
I'm
maybe
curious, did you ever
Actually-
look at something there and say, those folks in Fort Wayne don't know what they're doing?
Well, they told us that all the time.
Well,
They,
getting,
they ought to come down here and have to put these things together before they.
Oh, yeah.
And some of us did.
Yeah, sure.
getting back to that pilot run deal, now, I may have skipped when I told you where all I worked, but I did work as a test and repair supervisor for about a year on just tube type sets on final assembly. Whenever, what was his name, the superintendent of final assembly, it was I can't remember his name right now, but anyway, I worked back there, and they would take us supervisors, that the sets that were going to be built, they take us at night,
Right.
and we would build.
George Dunn.
Well, this was a general foreman that's taking
yeah.
I worked for George. I worked for everybody, just about back there. But they would take the supervisors and at night, and we would build these pilot runs,
Night, weekends.
night, weekends. and
Whatever.
If they
So
built
we-
10 or 20, whatever.
Right,
But we even started back earlier than that. We even built pre-pilots
right.
and got some of the bugs out.
Usually
And then we
5
come
to 10
run.
units
Yeah.
when we did a pre-pilot.
So it's a
I was in
longer,
engineering at the time.
longer process because we got what they're talking about to start with. We had a pilot run, but along the line we decided that we weren't getting enough information, so we went to the pre-pilot stage.
Well, it'd give you advanced chance to do wire harnessing and various component layout. And we went back in engineering and would make changes to the PC boards a lot of times and stuff like that too.
Was there
Get
any?
into interference?
I interrupted. I
No,
apologize.
that's okay. I was just
Adding to.
adding
Okay.
to what Bob was saying.
Was there? I guess pressure is the proper word to use. When a design came up with, I'm assuming that design was because the market was changing
Right.
and the competition was coming out with something you needed to respond. Those kind of
Well,
things.
that and development of your own product. I mean, as such, because remember, we got to remember also during this period of time, units were going from hand-wired sets to printed circuit boards, and
Well, put a date on that.
the 60s, early, probably.
Printed, I believe it was about 74.
Well, we
Something like that.
were using the CTC5 had several
Earlier
printed
now,
circuit
okay.
boards, the
Okay.
45 series.
So we're looking mid-60s was
Yeah.
sort of the
It had
evolution.
the sockets and all the components instead of wires running from sockets. The color board was a PC board,
Right.
but the power output tubes and some larger tubes were hand wired into
Right.
the chassis itself. But they did have a couple of PC boards in the early
You know,
60s.
So you had some sets that had
Portion.
tubes in them and had certain.
Well, the circuit boards were around with tubes.
Yeah.
In fact, the color board, the chroma board, the vertical was on a board, the IF was a board.
Audio.
One of the developments was the automatic frequency control, the AFT board, was a little module.
So there were some hybrid units in the
Well,
set.
it,
It wasn't, you wouldn't call them hybrids because they weren't solid state.
Well, in the beginning, that automatic frequency control AFC that controlled your
Yeah.
tuning, it was a tube. In later years, I'm not sure if it was a hybrid set. It was converted to a transistor circuit.
Yeah, but originally those were all tube units. Tubes were mounted on PC boards.
Okay, and this is what you're talking about, the plug-ins?
No,
No?
No?
Okay.
PC
Well,
board.
the tubes plugged into the boards.
Sure, okay.
Yeah, and they had sockets.
That's
just
my
like-
total knowledge of technology.
Yeah.
The two
Well,
plugs in.
The tube plugged into a socket on the board.
I showed you one of those PC boards that had the tube sockets in it that was soldered into the chassis and then hand wired up. But now later component boards in the 70s, early 70s or 74 had the component, the solid state, and they had the plug-in boards that just slide, the whole thing slid in. But nothing with tubes was ever interchangeable to my knowledge.
No.
They were all hardwired in, but even they were wired in PC boards.
Even the PC board was in there, but it was wired from that board to another board. there was little pins that stuck out, and we used wire wrap guns and would wire wrap these.
That's all hand done.
See, at that time when we were wire wrapping, Zenith was using a little cone, and they took their wires and would stick them into these little cones, and then they dipped the whole chassis pan to solder it. And that's where they kept promoting for years that they were hand wired. Well, they were, but
But
Did that work better?
no.
No, we had a lot of problems with that,
That's
plugging
the
those
approach.
wires in individually,
Yeah, that,
of connections and whatever.
So the Zenith system was a little better?
oh, I don't think so.
Okay.
In fact, you'd end up with cold solder joints a lot of times. And, because they had too
Zenith's
many-
probably had a better advertising campaign, I
Yeah,
guess.
I think so.
A moment ago, I was headed down the track where the designers, the engineers came up with a product because of improvements within your own thinking, within
Oh, sure.
Magnavox, as well as competition and general technology. When that was designed and sent down to Greenville to be produced, was there any pressure put on that you folks need to get this out in the marketplace in X amount of time? I mean, Kay was talking about testing, retesting, going back to a pre-model.
Well, it was all built into a schedule. I mean,
Okay.
now sometimes we got up against the wall on those schedules, but for the most part, we had a schedule, and there was a few times that we had to say, okay, it's not quite ready, and back off a little, you know.
Did you sense that there was a cooperation between the engineering, design, and production, and everybody was moving in the same direction, or was there any points of conflict?
Let me expound on that. To my knowledge, when everything came to production, it had already been hashed out with the engineering. The production was set up based on sales. If they had a new model, they had it ready when it came to Plant 3, in my opinion, to be manufactured. Now, occasionally in the electronic, we'd have a lot of rejects. And occasionally people from Fort Wayne would have to come down and find if it was our fault or if it was a design fault. You couldn't hardly pin any design faults on them people because they were, they had the pencil and all that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Kay, what's your opinion about that? Was there seen to be a good cooperation in terms of executing the plans and the product?
Well, yes and no. If I turned the product down, sometimes I had a hard time getting them to understand why.
Well, I think occasionally
well,
there would be component problems, would they not? When the component wouldn't work, occasionally it would.
In some
Or fit.
cases, you got signal interference. It's where you got two tracks too close together, and you know what I'm talking about, Bob.
Mhm.
Kind of a radiation
Things
problem.
that's going to cause problems out in the field. I won't say that they didn't work with us. They were under pressure too, the same as we
Right.
were. And of course, pressure brings on, stress and what have you. But being all in all, I mean, it kept improving all along, I think.
If we had a problem with excessive repair, excessive failures, rejects, I'm trying to say, we'd have the floor sitting full of them, and that it produced overtime. If you couldn't get them out during the 8 hours, then you stayed 4 more hours to get the rejects repaired. And if it was a consistent problem, but most time you would find it was a solder short, or very seldom perhaps in the beginning. Now, when they started up a model in final assembly, if you'd been running that particular unit for several months or several days, and everybody got used to the job, you wouldn't have any failures. But this is sure that we had a slowdown, and they lay people off, and you bring more people from other lines, you start having rejects because they weren't familiar with their job. But normally, after we ran a unit for several months at a time, then you wouldn't have much problem at all.
Usually in early production, when they did run into a problem with backed up, they'd call up Fort Wayne, and some of us, like me, would hop on the plane and be down here the next day, and
Working with them.
yeah. I've spent many weeks and weekends down here working on problems.
What were some of the other innovations that Magnavox brought to this marketplace that you'd like to share?
Well, you mentioned in starting out about cabinets and cabinet quality. Earlier, I was telling about the, we had all solid wood cabinets for many years, and we were one of the first people to actually develop a plastic cabinet fronts that looked like wood because of the process that we developed with another individual. I believe it was Schroeder was the name, the Schroeder process, which was where a guy would actually hand carve the wood cabinet and then put it into a silicon mold, and then from there went to a high temp mold that they could actually mold plastic. And Frank Fryman, the president of the company at the time,
Right.
he put up a lot of resistance to going to plastic, but economically it was the right thing to do, and eventually.
When was that transition made, approximately?
Again, it was probably early 60s. I can't tell you exactly when, but
We, in that unit behind us, you and I, the front that holds the picture tube in, we call them the fronts, they were metal.
Right.
And then just a
Die-cast.
couple years later, they developed it maybe, I'm going to say mid-60s, 65 or so, they went to this plastic.
well, a lot of the trim on the
Yeah,
sides
pink and white,
of that
blue.
were
You remember all those
plastic.
colors?
But
Green,
they were wood originally.
black.
Yeah.
You couldn't. It took a very trained person to tell the difference between the plastic ones and the wood ones when they first. I mentioned it when we first showed this. Or it was first showed to Frank Fryman. He walked in and said, "Well, I can tell the difference." And with that, everybody looked at it. Well, how does he tell from that? He reached in his pocket and got out a pocket knife and went over and took a chunk out of each cabinet and said, "This one's the wood one. That one's the plastic."
You can do it that way.
Well, that's that when he kicked off of the line.
Yeah.
He kicked one off of the line.
Oh, he
got
controlled the
upset.
line. I mean, we had product. I remember we were building a unit with a 10-watt amplifier. I don't know if you remember
Yeah.
that.
Oh, yeah.
He came down and said, "That model isn't selling. Stop it."
Yeah, I had the line that built the amplifiers.
Yeah.
And which model was that?
It
So
was
it's
a
just an amplifier that,
Oh, yeah.
it was a
Just
TV
top
that had a separate 10-watt amplifier to
Right.
really get
so you,
more sound. But of course, you had to pay more for that particular set, and that product wasn't selling. He knew the pulse of the market. I mean, he
Yeah,
was.
a lot of people we talk to say that Frank Fryman was Magnavox in the sense
I
of its
have to agree with that.
standards and quality. And of course, he joined the company in the 30s when Magnavox purchased his company, which was in
California.
right. But Frank Fryman's company was it located in Indiana at the time?
When he joined, I don't know.
Okay, but
where's Indiana or California?
I think it was in
Same as
California when
California.
he joined.
But that's when he joined in the
Yeah.
mid-30s and so forth, and rose to become president, passing suddenly in, 68, somewhere in there. But as I said, he talked with people, and without fail, they say the reputation, the quality of Magnavox was a reflection of Frank Fryman. What effect did his passing have on that?
Well, my opinion is we went through several presidents or controller, whatever you want to call it, the CEO type of that had different priorities than what Frank did. One of them tried to diversify the company into everything under the sun. We were in the trailer parts business, mobile home parts business. We were in music business. We were in furniture business. Baker Furniture was owned by Magnavox.
Is that the period where he got into making pinball machines and
that came
laser
a little
disc?
later.
a little later, but
Yeah.
it was part of that
Yeah.
diversification?
But we went through several people, and I don't want to speak ill of them because
Sure.
they were doing what they wanted, felt was the right thing for the company. But I think it took away from the original direction of the company.
Kay, did you sense in Greenville, since you were intimately right out there in production, did you sense when Frank Fryman passed a change over time?
Yes, to a certain degree. Of course, it's hard to determine the way the fluctuation of TVs at that time. You may be selling well, and just all of a sudden you're not selling so well. Because I remember one time they came down, Fort Wayne came down, we had already set up and already sent notices out to hire people to increase production. And over the weekend it was cut almost to the bone. You know, things like this happen that, you know, that
And that was
that
because,
sales.
so they reacted very quickly to
Yeah,
the market.
right.
And I think that changed a little bit after Frank, you know.
Yeah, it did.
It was
changed
slower.
some, yeah.
It slowed down. It wasn't quite as responsive to the market. Again, when you have a lot of irons and a lot of fires,
Yeah.
you know, I don't think well, he concentrated on our core business, and we, you know, when we started diversifying that affected the.
My first introduction to Magnavox, as I've shared with people, is when my dad bought a hi-fi in the late 50s, and my mother thought he'd lost his mind. It was too expensive, you know. Of course, he was in the lumber business, appreciated good work, so cabinetry and so forth. So I've always been interested in the record player portion of the business. Were you all involved in any of that development? The hi-fis and stereos and radios, any of that?
You know, the only time I was involved in any of the record players as at Plant 2, probably around 1960 or a little before. We bought changers come out of Europe, or England.
Yeah.
Come out of England, and when they came in, I had a department set up to test them. They weren't completed. We had some harnessing work that we did between the changer and the TV that we added to it, and then we completely tested the changer before it was put into a cabinet.
What time period was that?
It was early 60s.
Early 60s.
Yeah.
Okay. How long did they make record players in Greenville?
I don't know of any record players being made in Greenville. They were made, some of the changers were made in England, like you said, they bought, and I think Jefferson City made some.
Okay.
They made units in Jeff City together.
So do you have a general idea when Magnavox ceased producing two-ways or three-way consoles?
I don't remember. I left the service department in '81, and I don't think we had any three-ways at all then that had record players and TVs in them. We had some components, some small stereo cabinets that were still coming through that had radios and record players in them, but I don't recall any three-ways at that time in
I think it was
'81.
probably late 60s, maybe 66, 68, somewhere around in there. We stopped making any of the three-ways that I can remember.
Why was that ceased?
It just wasn't popular. Size was one of the biggest things. People started wanting more compact units, and I think, you know, when you look at a three-way, I mean, it took a lot of real estate.
And they weigh a ton.
And
I think everybody, at that point, people were getting to the point where they wanted a separate radio, phono, tape player, whatever, and the TV.
the TV was primary at that time, and the kids were probably wanting to use the record player, and they couldn't because the parents were using the TV.
Right.
So they just didn't buy anymore.
So societal changes, lifestyle,
Yeah,
apartments,
lifestyle,
and so forth wouldn't accommodate some three ways that I've seen.
You need to talk to somebody from that worked in Morristown. You know, as Morristown and Greenville both was combined in building the Odyssey. You remember the Odyssey?
Oh, well.
And could you say a little bit more about that?
It's a game. It's a game oriented. With the kit when we shipped it out, you know, for as a finished product to play on your TV screen.
First video game, yeah.
First
Yeah,
video
remember-
game produced was Odyssey by Magnavox.
Yeah, we shipped a rifle with them. You want to aim that rifle, and you shoot out
Those
ducks or whatever.
a lot of those sets came through the service department that had the game on them, and it was built in the set, and you flipped the switch, and then, like you said, you had a rifle. You could shoot things that went, and it had the photo thing in the end of it, and that light would line up with it on the screen, and it would work that way. But those wasn't manufactured. I didn't see very many of those.
Oh, they only lasted
A few
2 or
months.
3 years.
Yeah.
2 years.
But that was one of the things that I think happened after the Fryman era.
Yes, that was
is
after the frame.
we got diversified into some of that kind of things, and we developed systems like that. And we really, after they sort of went over through their initial period and
Introduction and
introduction
sales spike.
and other people started copying and making. We just sort of faded out of it. We'd drop it.
So there wasn't a persistence to
Yeah.
stay in that piece of
Yeah.
the business.
And we really had some very technological advances in that group. I remember the design group that did that work. And
Well, you look at some of the products, Laser Vision and the Odyssey and the PC, the computer. I can't even think of the name of it now. And I've had people tell me that they were really good computers, had a screen and printer together, but there was just so much competition in the marketplace. It just wasn't.
Now, in the Odyssey, it was sales. The dealers didn't want to fool with them because they didn't make enough money on them. There's very thin margin between the cost and the sales.
Volume.
If you went in and asked about them, why they would show it to you, but they didn't push it. The dealers didn't push it. Salesmen.
You were talking about, we maybe didn't talk about it, but when I still worked in production, part-time I was sent to Plant 2, and we had a manufacturing facility down there that produced some sets for other companies, Montgomery Ward and being one, and they were mostly black and white, or all black and white, I guess, for several years that they sold to other companies, Monkey Ward they call them, and Sentinel, yeah.
we made special sets for companies like Lowell's and various other companies. The biggest difference was there was just maybe a minor feature difference between them. Sometimes there was none. It was just a different model number.
Logo.
Yeah,
Some of them
labels.
just logo.
Just a little label difference.
That was it.
Our line, Montgomery Ward and Sentinel, and I forget, but they would, even the tubes, I'm not sure about the tube sets. I know the cabinets would have their model number and their name on them, and the boxes and everything were Sentinel. But I don't know about the tube or component parts were labeled or not.
I've had some folks share with me that they thought when Magnavox bought Crosley,
Pennsylvania.
no, Crosley
TV.
radio or
They bought the name basically.
okay.
Yeah.
Was that an influx of technology into Magnavox, or was
Well,
it just purely a?
It was an influx of people. There was quite a.
Wayne Keenan was he with Crosley, and seemed like some of the, what was that guy over the chassis repair that was, didn't he come from Crosley?
There's several of those guys come from Crosley and Sentinel.
Fred.
Let's see, Ralph Sanderman. He was
Yeah,
in
that's what I was trying to think of.
Yeah, he come from.
There was
But they didn't bring much technology knowledge with them or innovation. It was more,
Well, they really didn't make any influence into engineering. Most of that was into production or plant control. John Gross, for example, came from Crosley. What was the guy that had Hyrel?
You're like me, I can't
you,
think.
you know, I'm just. But anyway, there was quite a group of people that came.
Yeah.
Were very good participators. I mean, you know, they were quite knowledgeable of production
Right.
and fit in quite well. But from a design engineering, we had no
impact.
No impact.
Yeah, the biggest headache I know of, especially with the Sentinel, they had a lot of parts on hand, and actually chassis built, I think. But those units were built out. They were actually Sentinel parts, you know, because we had bought, Magnavox had bought the company, and they wanted to use up those parts, and our design was, we had a terrible time building those.
Terrible time to get it all fit together.
Yeah, and I think that's probably why they sold out. I don't know, Magnavox bought them. So their designs and their engineering and all was lacking.
What impact did Philips purchasing Magnavox have on Magnavox per se? Because you get a sense Magnavox had a culture and a belief system in terms of values. We're talking about Frank Freiman and so forth. And of course, his passing was an effect. But what impact did Philips purchasing Magnavox have on the company, the products?
The only
At first, I don't think there was very much impact at all. They pretty well left us alone. Of course, they introduced some of their products that they wanted us to build, like you mentioned, the disc player and things like that, video disc player. And
Video displayer. That's a new term I haven't heard. Talking about laser?
the laser disc.
Laser
yeah,
disc?
yeah.
Okay.
That was a Philips product that they said, here's a product you're going to build,
Oh,
you know,
okay.
type of thing. And there were several other small things like that.
it's a DVD player now,
Yeah.
or video
Today's
video.
version of.
Yeah.
But there's another good example of a product that they helped develop, and then they sort of backed out of the whole program, and then the DVD market came on, and they were behind. You know, if they would have stayed up with them, they would have been with them or ahead.
Well, it's my understanding that I know in production if they had a set that they wanted manufactured, the quality control on it was a lot higher than it was on the Magnavox. They wouldn't accept Magnavox. I think, you know, in some stuff it was 20%, like in resistors, some on 10%, and some 5%. Well, Philips would stay at a 5%. They wouldn't go any variation. They wanted it picture tubes and everything. They wanted it to be the high-end set when they manufactured it. And then the next changes that came in was when they bought Sylvania, and they incorporated Sylvania into the Magnavox. And it just, like I said, that's when I left, because I had other options, and to have to repair everything that Sylvania made and everything that Magnavox manufactured was a pretty good job. But a lot of people did master it. I know they incorporated some of the Sylvania sets into the big screen sets that they manufactured, and they had the plug-in boards in them. And basically, they changed over the later years. They changed over to all the manufacturer was in Magnavox and not Sylvania Designs, but it was sold under Sylvania name.
Yeah, we bought the rights for so many years.
Yeah, right.
5 years, I believe, or something like that. We bought.
Kay, you were started with Magnavox virtually when it began in Greenville. I mean, 50 and came in 47. So you saw a lot of change over the years between the 50s, 60s. What about the impact of Philips, given your experience with that many years with the original Magnavox?
Philips operated a little differently. You know, we had to get adjusted to them, and they had to get adjusted to us. And just as I believe Bob said, you know, they let us alone the first couple of years. We were all wondering what was going to happen. You know how some other company buy you out. But they, like Bob said, I believe as you said it was, they let us alone for a couple of years. And then when they came in, I mean, it's pretty much cut and dried. you do this and this and so. You don't, just like we were saying here about the parts. Most all of those, they wanted the top of the line in parts. When he was saying 5%, 10%, they wanted most all their products to be 5%, and in a lot of cases 2%, to get the very best picture quality and what have you, less variations.
Actually, I'm not, speaking from an engineering standpoint, to me, what that said is what they didn't do the job of taking their circuits and okay, you develop a circuit to have a certain value component in it. And what you should do with that component is start putting the tolerances to that component, like I said, 5%, then you spread out to 10%, and see what the effect is of it. They didn't spend as much time doing that as Magnavox did. Consequently, you ended up spending extra money buying closer tolerance parts that weren't necessarily necessary, because it was just a matter, gee, in a lot of cases a circuit would work just as fine with a 20% part, and the consumer would have never known the difference. And I don't mean the part's bad.
Right.
It's just a wider tolerance part. It might change for example, in an audio circuit, it might change the volume range by a dB or something on one end or the other. While had they spread their components out, they could have lowered the price.
Well, some components, as we learned in electronics school, that if it was a wattage, for instance, and a percentage, if it's a 100-watt part, you can't go below that, but you can go above it without any problem. Or the resistance, if it was 100 ohms and 5% would be 5% below that or 5% over, it wouldn't make any difference. But in some cases, maybe capacitors or coils, it might. But they did specify that they wanted a better quality picture tube and everything, a better percentage, lower percentage of variation, in other words.
Well, I'm absolutely fascinated about hearing you all talk about this. And I have the feeling we could probably sit here for another 2 or 3 hours and keep going through things. I don't want to keep you all day. As we look to preserve the history of Magnavox in the community and sharing this information even with the History Center up at Fort Wayne that has artifacts of Magnavox, sort of in a summation, what would you like future generations to know about Magnavox?
Well, me personally, a lot of people's livelihood depended on Magnavox. I mean, a lot of people lived, their life, or they bought their car, they bought their TV. There's a lot of people made a good living at Magnavox, and Magnavox was a good employer. They treated their employees reasonably fair. I mean, some of the early people would say they were abused kind of because they didn't have a union. But I worked at other places, and Magnavox treated you fair, and the work wasn't that hard. And they gave you a break as far as give you a chance to advance. And I think Magnavox reputation would be, in my opinion, a great company to work for and a great asset to Greene County and Greenville. A couple of things that we haven't mentioned, and I doubt if any of us knows anything about it, but now the organs were manufactured at Magnavox, sold Magnavox organ for a good while in Greenville. And they were when I worked there, it's kind of the tail end of it. They manufactured some when I was down at Plant 2. Fred Thomas was over that.
What were the years of production of those organs?
He was over quality. I was over the production for
I think they started
a year or two, I guess, a couple of years. All of TV.
About 58, 59.
Because they were first made in Urbana.
Urbana.
And then the line was set down.
Right.
So
Yeah.
what were the years of production?
Well, I started in '63, and they built some occasionally, maybe a 10 or 20 at a time when I was there in '63.
Kay, can you put a timeline on production of those organs?
Really, there was not, just like Stanley said, there was just very few produced.
later.
I had just a handful of people on it, and we'd build up, say 10 units. And most of that was tested offline in a lab situation, I would call it.
So is this
And
1960?
it just didn't it didn't fit in with what we were trying to do. It's production for TV, of course. They had this, and
They would.
they just didn't have the. I don't think they had the engineering at all.
They didn't. When they closed Urbana, a lot of the engineers were there. Came to Fort Wayne and joined other groups.
I think they may have just been building some stuff up over parts they had left over when I was there, because they was, like you said, there was only just 2 or 3 people over there at times, and I think I helped maybe put some of them together at a time or two when I didn't. When I wasn't needed.
So the general production time was what, 60 to 64? I mean,
Well, I think
it'd been
earlier than that.
64, 65.
Yeah, it was probably about the end of it.
Because we moved into Plant 2 in 63. Summer of 63 we moved in, and it was after that. Well, no, I'm sorry. You're right. It was before that.
Yeah.
Well,
before
everything
that
left Plant 2 to go to Plant 3 in 63, right? So it had to be.
Yeah, and I couldn't run up and down the road all the time, so they give the organ
so late 50s until 63.
As you said,
yeah.
to the,
John Lane, this is what I'm trying to think of, was general foreman of Magnavox in final assembly in early 60s. 60s.
yeah.
So when did they quit using Plant 1?
I think he'd probably be able to tell you that, don't
I don't know. Well, as far as production of any, like the TVs or what have you,
They might have.
I
had
would
some-
say it was about 55, 56.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought.
I come back. I was trying to think when I came back out of service in 55 if they were still using. I think they were still building some. Oh yes. Let's don't get into that.
We
but
did cabinet work down there, on into the 60s.
the Sonic was
Sonoboy.
down there too. The Sonoboy.
Sonoboys,
Sonoboy,
which we
Yeah.
were building for
It
military.
sold
which was a
radar unit. wasn't it?
radar
Yeah,
unit
radar
for
unit that we had a
military. Was that
contract.
for submarines?
Submarine.
Submarine
Right.
to detect submarines?
Well, they drop them in the water and it detects submarine
And
movement.
those were made in Plant 1?
yes.
Yeah.
That was made
I-
like one.
Some of the repairmen told me they used silver solder in all those.
They did.
Yeah.
And they didn't use lead acid or silver solder.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were designed in Fort Wayne,
And I didn't have any part in that. It was totally a self-entity, you might say. Government contract, you had government inspectors and what have you.
And as a point of summary, I was asking Stanley, what would you like future generations to know about Magnavox? What personal observations or feelings? Okay.
Well, I think, as overall, it was a good quality product. It met the criteria of the times. And as Stanley said, I feel that the people were treated fairly. I know some feel like they probably weren't. And I think that any of us here that's retired from Magnavox would recommend the Magnavox line to the future generations. I know we had our problems, ups and downs, as any company does. I'm speaking mainly of quality-wise, or sometimes design. But I wouldn't be a bit ashamed of, say, buy a Magnavox.
How about you, Bob?
Well, I think Magnavox was definitely an innovative leader in the industry. We did things that the rest of the industry had to catch up with. For example, we had magnetic field-free areas on our production lines, so that when we ship product different places in the United States, we didn't get a picture shift. We did a number of things like that, even the high rel we mentioned earlier, the testing of all product. These are steps ahead of anybody else in the industry. And I think because of that, we did have some extremely reliable. I know I could dig up numbers that would show how much our mean time between failure rates improved over the years. I mean, when I remember when early 60s, 1,500 hours between failure was considered a pretty good television set. And when I retired in '97, we were looking at 100,000 hours.
Amazing.
So quality had came a long way. Of course, solid state was a big contributor to that.
Well, I want to thank you all for sharing your time and your experiences with us. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Thank you.